I'm Joey Tedesco, and you're watching the Cartoon Palooza. This month, it's all about the Disney live-action adaptations. It's hard to imagine how Disney has been on a roll with getting at least one live-action movie based on one of their animated films a year. Now, when did this trend start? Last time we talked about 101 Dalmatians getting remade, but that was such a long time ago, I don't know how it would contribute to the current trend. So let's talk about the film that really got it kicked off. But before we begin, let's have a brief history lesson on the relation between Disney and their relation with the story of Alice in Wonderland. Oh, for crying out loud, what'd you come here for, just jokes? You're gonna learn something, get over it. Believe it or not, Alice in Wonderland may have been Disney's longest running adaptation even before there was a Disney Animation Studios. Back in the 20s, Walt, Ub Iwerks, Harmon and Ising, they were animators working in Kansas City adapting stories inspired by the Lewis Carroll tale. They were innovative, audiences dug it, and it caught the attention of producers that would give the animators their start with Oswald, and then Mickey, and the rest is history. Flash forward years later, and we get a little known animated film that you may have heard of. You know, the one with the cute little blonde girl, she falls down a rabbit hole and enters a world of nonsense and no logic. You may have heard of it, but it's one of those lesser known Disney films, right? This was one of those animated films from the original team of Disney animators known as the Nine Old Men, a title that distinguished themselves to the OG animators of Disney animated films, starting from Snow White. Two animators from the crew, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, will continue working with the company until Fox and the Hound. This is where they got to work with some new animators, including the misunderstood goth kid we all knew in high school, Tim Burton. Yep, that's right. Tim Burton was doing in-between work for some of the original animators of the animated classic Alice in Wonderland. Flash forward decades later when he was approached to remake the film whose animators helped him get his start. A film that ties to Disney way back before Disney was even a thing. So to say that there was a lot of things I was looking forward to when it comes to this movie is an understatement. Knowing all of this prior to seeing the film made me one of the few people anticipating the film like no other. Especially in hindsight, since Alice in Wonderland as a film may have had areas that needs improving. For starters, the book didn't really follow a straight narrative. Alice would go from chapter to chapter encountering new faces, some familiar, and dealing with new challenges. The movie followed this format, which made the overall story feel discontinuous. The irony to this is that the original was such a faithful adaptation that it took the original problem the book had rather than improve on it. So after seeing the film, all I gotta say is, Tim, what'd you do? So our movie stars Alice, and she's not the young, curious protagonist we saw in the past. She's a grown woman whose personality seems to resemble chalk. However, we see the iconic white rabbit lead her to fall down the hole into Wonderland. The movie starts off where you'll see more of a mature Alice, and some of the imagery of the original books come to play. You even got characters like the Jabberwocky that didn't show up in the animated film. Things go a little downhill though, once we find out that there's a prophecy when Alice must defeat the Red Queen's tyrannical rule by slaying the Jabberwocky. Even though this isn't really the Red Queen as much as she resembles the Queen of Hearts. Alright, so this might seem like nitpicking, and I do think Helena Bonham Carter does well with what she's given. However, I'll never understand the need to call her the Red Queen and not the Queen of Hearts, especially since the Red Queen is a different character from a different book. She doesn't even have an army of chess pieces, she's got the playing cards like the Queen of Hearts. She says the iconic "off with her head," which is completely different. Listening to the story, you would imagine the film was very similar to the movie Hook, where a famous fictional character grows up and has to rediscover his past in order to save the future. However, what worked about Hook is how you get a sense that there's some change going on with the main character in his journey. Because Alice starts off in the film thinking unconventionally and acting improper, you never get a sense that she's making a change. This kind of makes her character seem static, and what makes the idea of the hero's journey falter. If the main character doesn't go through a change that helps them overcome their obstacles, does it make the obstacles worth overcoming? In this aspect, it makes the movie feel boring. It's a shame because there's a lot of great animation and visual flair to the film. Sort of. The movie relies on a lot of computer animated imagery, where whole sets and characters are digitally animated or done in post. Coincidentally, this would be the second time Disney's produced a hybrid live-action animated movie inspired by Alice in Wonderland, as I mentioned before. However, I think a lot of Tim Burton's visual flair gets lost in the favor of CG. I'd like to believe that Burton's best work comes when he knows what he's looking at. A lot of the effects Burton's worked with in the past have always been practical, or he had a sense of knowing what he's working with. Something tangible and something you can see. Because a majority of the film's effects are finalized in post, and the people on set only get an idea of what it could look like, makes it hard to tell with what the final product's gonna look like. In the end, all I remember is seeing a lot of drab imagery and a lot of dark shadows and things that are supposed to pop up just sort of get blended with the rest of the images. Granted, you know most of these effects are fake, and it's not like Tim Burton's a stranger to dated effects, but a movie like Mars Attacks, where bad CG was intentional and made the joke work, you can't say the same for here. The one defining factor though that seems to be the running theme on whether or not you're gonna like this film is the way they ground Wonderland. Or as it's actually called, Underland. You get it? Because it's underground? Yeah, whatever. Remember how I mentioned that the original didn't really have a strict plot due to its sequential nature? Despite being a criticism towards the original, it does take away the charm when you have to make it follow a strict narrative with rules and conventions. Especially when those conventions would end up contradicting themselves dozens of times. Well, do you think it would help Alice to slay the Jabberwocky by eating cake that makes you grow 10 times the size? I mean, why does it have to be Alice? Anybody could do that. I wouldn't be so bothered by this, given that the charm of the books is how it reveled in making madness seem logical. But the fact is that the movie lacks that madness, and it makes it seem less, well, I hope you see what I mean here. Like, how weird is it when you find out that the Red Queen's head is comically large, not for the sheer fact that it's a silly design, but because she's got a tumor? That's like finding out the Cheshire Cat can only vaporize and reappear due to like a scientific process. That just takes away the fun of it. There are a few things to appreciate about this movie, but if I told you going in that this was going to be a Tim Burton extravaganza, I would feel pretty bummed out. Especially since the Alice in Wonderland story has had such a significance to Disney, not only as a film, but as part of the company's legacy. This just turns out to be a subpar experience. How it's managed to make the money it's made is beyond me, but I'm gonna go off a theory, and hearing the words Tim Burton, Disney, and Alice in Wonderland starring Johnny Depp is enough to get people to get into the theaters, just on the star power alone. I can't rewatch this film without thinking about the awkward pacing, lack of interest from the protagonist, probably because they didn't even know what they were looking at, and sort of sets the precedent towards how I feel about the current adaptations of Disney classics today. Ironically, out of all the Disney remakes, this one is so far removed from the original that you can make a decent argument that this is just a straight up adaptation of the source material and not the animated film. Here's what I'm gonna say about this movie. If you see a white rabbit, don't follow it down the rabbit hole and forget about it. And those are my thoughts on Alice in Wonderland. And in case you didn't know this, next week, I'm going to be reviewing Beauty and the Beast. Rather than look at all the mistakes and all the possibilities of things going wrong, I really hope this movie turns out okay. I hope they're not just going to shamefully rip off things that worked in the movie, and I hope they're going to take problems that existed in the original animated movie and actually improve on them. So here's the hoping. That unlike most of the other Disney animated adaptations into live action, that this one is going to be the absolute best.
It ain't.